AITAH for telling my teacher to shut up? I can't believe I'm even in this situation right now. But here we are. So, a few weeks ago, my boyfriend surprised me with a car. Like, out of nowhere. He just shows up and hands me the keys, telling me he wanted to make my life a little easier. And, to be clear, I was totally floored. It's not every day someone gifts you something like that, especially someone our age. At first, I couldn't even believe it was real. I thought he was joking. And then, suddenly, there I was, standing in front of my own car, keys in hand, practically speechless. And don't get me wrong, it's been amazing. Having my own car has completely changed my life. Before this, I was either depending on my mom or taking the bus everywhere. Which, let's be honest, was not exactly ideal, especially when it came to getting to school, running errands, going to work. It was a hassle. So now, I can just hop in the car and go wherever I need to without planning a whole bus route or asking someone to drive me. It's given me this new sense of independence. And honestly, I feel so lucky. I don't even know what I did to deserve it. But here's the thing, as grateful as I am, I feel a little awkward about it too. I mean, how many people my age get gifted a car by their boyfriend? I didn't ask for it. It's not like I went around dropping hints about needing a car. I never expected him to do something like that for me. He's just a generous guy. And I know he wanted to do something special. But now I feel like there's this weird spotlight on me. People at school have started noticing. And I've already caught a few sideways glances. I don't want people to think I'm spoiled or that I just take stuff for granted. Because that's the farthest thing from the truth. And then there's my teacher. It started out small. I think the first time my teacher made a comment. It was almost subtle. She glanced over as I walked in one morning, keys in hand, and just said, "Oh, must be nice to get a free ride in a car you didn't pay for." I remember kind of laughing it off, thinking she was joking. I mean, yeah, it's rare to get a car as a gift. But it wasn't like I'd done anything wrong. So I just laughed and moved on, hoping she'd let it go. But the comments didn't stop there. Every few days, there'd be something, little digs. It was like she had this running joke that only she found funny. "Don't forget to thank your boyfriend for the lift." Or, "Drive home safe in your gifted car." And every time, there'd be that tight little smile. Like she knew she was pushing the line but didn't care. I tried to ignore it, to laugh along and not make it a big deal. After all, she was my teacher, and I didn't want to make things awkward. But honestly, the comments started to bug me. It's one thing for friends to tease you, but this felt different. I hadn't asked for the car. I hadn't flaunted it around either. I just showed up to school, same as before, only now with a bit more freedom to get there on my own. I tried not to let it get to me, but with each new comment, it started to feel personal, like she was trying to make a point, though I couldn't figure out what her point even was. I started to dread walking into her class. Every time I'd hear a new dig, my stomach would tighten, and I'd feel that prick of frustration. But I kept telling myself it wasn't worth making a scene over. Maybe she was just jealous or thought she was being funny, or maybe she was just having a hard time and taking it out on me. I tried to brush it off, to let it go, hoping she'd get bored of the comments eventually and move on. But she didn't. It was like she was just waiting for every opportunity to throw in another snide remark. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I didn't want to cause any drama, especially not with a teacher. The comments went from occasional to constant, like she was waiting for any excuse to bring up my car in front of everyone. One morning, I just sat down, barely had my notebook open, when she tossed out, "Bet you didn't have to rush like the rest of us, having a boyfriend to buy you a ride." The class laughed, but not in a fun way. It was more like that uncomfortable chuckle people do when they're not sure what to think. I could feel my face getting hot, and I just tried to keep my head down, forcing a little laugh that felt as fake as it sounded. But after that, it only got worse. She'd bring up my car in the middle of lessons, like it was some running gag she couldn't let go of. I remember one time during a class discussion, she singled me out with, "Maybe you can buy your way to an A with that car of yours." My stomach twisted, and I wanted to sink into the floor. Everyone in class just sort of glanced over at me, some with smirks, others looking just as confused as I felt. I didn't know what I'd done to deserve it. But there I was, feeling like the punchline to some joke I'd never asked to be part of. Every time she'd throw out another comment, I'd tell myself to let it go, to keep my cool. I reminded myself that she was my teacher, that getting upset wouldn't help, that maybe it'd just encourage her more. But the truth was, I was angry, and more than that, I felt humiliated. I worked hard in school, kept my head down, didn't flaunt anything, and definitely hadn't asked for this kind of attention. And now I had to walk into her class every day, knowing that at any moment, she'd throw in another jab. Something to make me feel small in front of my classmates. The worst part was that it started to feel personal. Like she wasn't just poking fun, she was trying to make me feel guilty for something I didn't even have control over. The car was a gift. Plain and simple, but the way she talked, you'd think I demanded it or acted entitled to it. She'd say things like, "Must be nice to have everything handed to you," or, "Some of us have to work for what we have." I was stunned. I wanted to shout back, to tell her she didn't know anything about my life, about how hard I'd worked for everything else. But I kept it inside, telling myself it wasn't worth making a scene. My patience was wearing thin. It was like a slow burn, and I could feel myself reaching the edge. where the embarrassment and anger were starting to bubble over. But I kept reminding myself that she was my teacher, that I had to show respect, that it'd look bad on me if I snapped. Each day I told myself I'd get through it, that maybe today would be the day she'd drop it and move on. But she didn't, and each comment just pushed me closer to my breaking point. I don't know what it was about that day, but I walked into class already feeling on edge, like I was holding my breath, just waiting for her to say something. Maybe I'd reached the limit of how much I could swallow. Maybe it was the way she looked at me when I sat down, with this little smirk that made it clear she hadn't let it go. Whatever it was, I felt the tension in my chest, and I knew I was one more comment away from snapping. Sure enough, right in the middle of class, she took her shot. We were discussing something totally unrelated, and out of nowhere, she dropped it again, this time with a comment that seemed to hit even harder, as if she'd saved it just for me. Well, I guess some of us don't have to worry about things like that. Must be nice to have a boyfriend who takes care of all your needs. Her voice had that sarcastic lilt, and I could feel the weight of the words settle over the room as everyone went quiet. My heart was pounding, my cheeks burned, and before I knew it, the words were out of my mouth, loud and clear. Can you just shut up about it? The moment it slipped out, I felt a rush of both relief and regret. The whole room went dead silent, every eye on me. She looked stunned, her mouth slightly open, like she couldn't believe what I just said. And to be honest, neither could I. My brain was screaming at me for saying it, for letting my anger get the best of me. But a part of me couldn't help feeling satisfied, like I'd finally taken back some control after weeks of feeling humiliated. For a few agonizing seconds, no one moved. She just stared at me, and I stared back, caught between wanting to apologize and wanting to stand my ground. I could see her expression shift, that initial shock melting into something more controlled, almost cold. She cleared her throat and turned back to the board, continuing with the lesson as if nothing had happened. But the tension in the room was so thick, you could feel it in the air. No one dared to look at me, and I kept my eyes on my desk, feeling a weird mix of shame and relief. The rest of the class passed in a blur. I could barely focus, my mind racing as I replayed the moment over and over. Part of me felt triumphant, like I'd finally stood up for myself, finally told her that enough was enough. But the other part of me was panicking, thinking about how I just crossed a line, about what this would mean. She was still my teacher, and telling her to shut up wasn't exactly the respectful response. When the bell rang, I grabbed my stuff and bolted, avoiding everyone's eyes as I made my way to the door. I could feel their stares, the silent questions hanging in the air. I knew they were wondering if I'd get in trouble, if she'd report me, if I'd be called into the principal's office. But I didn't care about any of that. I just needed to get out of there, to escape the weight of everyone's judgment and figure out what had just happened. As I walked down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that was slowly creeping in, filling the space where my anger had been just minutes before. Yes, she'd pushed me, humiliated me, made me feel small, but I'd told my teacher to shut up, right in front of everyone. I'd let her get to me, let her make me into someone I didn't even recognize. And now, I had to face the consequences. The next day, I walked into school with a knot in my stomach the size of a rock. I didn't know what to expect, but I was sure there'd be fallout. I hadn't heard anything yet, hadn't been called to the office or pulled aside by anyone, but that didn't ease the dread I felt. It was like I was holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sure enough, about an hour into the morning, I was called into the principal's office. I'd barely set foot inside when I saw her there, sitting across from him, her expression icy but composed. She didn't even look at me, just sat with her arms crossed, like I was some unruly kid she had to deal with. I took a seat across from them, my hands shaking slightly. Part of me felt the urge to apologize on the spot, but the other part, the part still angry and humiliated, held back. The principal started in, calm and even-toned, asking me to explain what had happened. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting, almost daring me to admit I was wrong. I told him the truth, as much as I could. I explained how her comments had been going on for weeks, how they'd embarrassed me in front of the class, how I'd tried to brush them off. And yes, I admitted I'd told her to shut up, even though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. I didn't make excuses, I just laid it out, trying to be as honest as possible, hoping he'd see where I was coming from. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. I expected the principal to side with her, to tell me I was out of line, that disrespect like that was unacceptable. And in a way, he did. He talked about respect, about how I'd crossed a boundary, and about how shut up wasn't the way to handle a situation with a teacher, no matter the circumstances. But he also said something I didn't expect. He acknowledged that the comments she'd made were inappropriate, that they'd clearly affected me, and that as a teacher, she had a responsibility to keep personal judgments out of the classroom. Hearing him say that made me feel a mix of relief and guilt. On one hand, I felt validated, like he understood that her comments hadn't just been harmless jokes. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the guilt gnawing at me. I'd still told her to shut up, right in front of everyone. I'd lost my cool, let my anger take over, and made a scene. The principal decided that we'd both have to apologize. I'd have to apologize for my outburst, and she'd have to acknowledge that her comments were inappropriate. I felt like I'd been let off easy, but there was still this sinking feeling inside me, The reality of it was, I hadn't wanted things to go this way. I didn't want an apology that felt forced. I didn't want this ugly, public fallout. I just wanted her to stop. To understand that her comments were hurting me, not making me laugh. Later that day, I found myself sitting alone, replaying the whole situation in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about what my parents would say if they found out. How disappointed they'd be. Telling a teacher to shut up wasn't something they'd taught me to do. I felt a pang of shame. Like I'd let them down. Like I'd let myself down. I tried talking to a close friend, hoping to get some reassurance. They listened, nodding along, agreeing that the teacher had been out of line. But when I mentioned how guilty I felt, they looked at me like I was crazy. You're not in the wrong here, they said, their voice firm. She pushed you. If anything, you had every right to say something. Their words were comforting, but they didn't fully erase the guilt. The nagging feeling that I should have handled it differently. That night, I lay awake, going over every comment she'd made. Every time I'd forced a laugh or looked down, hoping it'd end, I thought about how I could have spoken up sooner. Told her directly that her comments bothered me. But then again, would it have made a difference? Or would it have just made things worse? I didn't know. I still didn't know. All I knew was that I felt like I was caught in this tug of war between guilt and justification. Between feeling like I'd defended myself and feeling like I'd crossed a line. Maybe both were true. Maybe I'd done what I had to do. But in a way I regretted. Maybe there was a line between self-respect and respect for others. And I just learned the hard way how easy it was to blur that line. Over the next few days, things felt tense, but quieter. My teacher didn't say a word to me in class. No comments, no looks, nothing. She taught her lessons, kept things professional, and didn't go anywhere near the topic of my car or my personal life. It was like she'd finally understood. Or maybe she just didn't want to have another confrontation. Either way, the silence was a relief. Even if it was a bit uncomfortable, I kept my head down, focusing on my work, trying to shake off a lingering mix of regret and pride that still clung to me. But even as things calmed down in class, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about where things had gone wrong. The anger that had flared up in me that day felt so foreign. And the words I'd spoken, telling her to shut up, still echoed in my head. I was caught between feeling justified and feeling like I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Telling a teacher to shut up wasn't something I'd ever imagined myself doing. No matter the circumstances, but that day, in that moment, it had felt almost involuntary, like the words had been waiting, pushed to the surface after weeks of holding it all in. So, I started asking myself, was it worth it? Had I really needed to go that far to get her to stop? And the more I thought about it, the more complicated it all felt. I knew that my teacher's comments had crossed a line. She'd brought my personal life into the classroom, used my situation as a punchline without knowing a thing about me or the story behind the gift. And that wasn't okay, but at the same time, I wondered if there'd been another way. A way to stand up for myself without losing my cool. A way to say, this isn't okay, without giving up my own sense of control. I spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to have boundaries and what it means to respect yourself. Even when someone in a position of authority seems to be taking advantage of their power. It was a new feeling for me, realizing that it's possible to feel both proud and ashamed at the same time. To feel like you did the right thing but went about it the wrong way. Maybe that was part of growing up, learning that standing up for yourself sometimes means finding the right balance. Even if it means making mistakes along the way. I also thought about respect. How it goes both ways. Just because she was my teacher didn't mean she had the right to put me down or use me as a joke in front of my peers. Respect is supposed to be mutual. And I realized that maybe I'd been putting up with her comments not out of respect, but out of fear of standing up to authority, fear of creating waves, fear of being seen as that kid who talks back to the teacher. But what kind of respect is that, if it comes at the cost of my own dignity? It wasn't about the car. It wasn't about the gift. It was about feeling like my space, my life, had been invaded in a way that wasn't fair. And finally, after everything that happened, I started to understand that it was okay to set boundaries, even if it meant challenging someone in a position of authority. I could still be respectful without letting someone else make me feel small. I knew I'd probably see her around school for the rest of the year. We'd likely have to deal with each other in class every day. But now, instead of feeling guilty or embarrassed, I started thinking about how I could handle things differently if something like this happened again. Maybe I could find a way to speak up sooner, before the frustration had a chance to build. Maybe I could pull someone aside, talk to them directly, say, hey, this isn't okay, before it reached a breaking point. I realized that respecting myself doesn't mean waiting until I can't take it anymore. It means addressing things early. Being open and honest, even if it feels uncomfortable. The whole thing had left me with a lot of questions and not many answers. But I'd learned something about myself, about my boundaries, about where I stood when it came to respect and self-worth. And maybe that was enough. For now, I knew I wasn't perfect, and I knew I still had a lot to learn. But I also knew that I wouldn't let anyone, teacher or otherwise, make me feel ashamed for something I hadn't done wrong. And as I looked back on everything, I started to feel a little bit of peace. Like I was finally ready to let go of the guilt and hold on to the lesson. As time went on, the whole incident started to feel less like a painful memory and more like a lesson I'd learned the hard way. I kept showing up to class, kept doing my work, but the tension had mostly faded. My teacher and I had found an unspoken truce. She didn't bring up my personal life anymore. And I didn't let my resentment get the best of me. We just got through the days, each sticking to our roles, each respecting the boundaries I'd finally set. What surprised me was how much this experience changed the way I saw myself. Before all of this, I think I'd underestimated the importance of standing up for my own comfort, my own privacy. I'd always been the kind of person who tried to avoid conflict, who let things slide for the sake of keeping the peace. I thought that was what respect meant, keeping quiet, staying out of the way, letting others lead even if I felt uncomfortable. But now, I saw things differently. I realized that respect didn't mean letting someone else make me feel small. Respect went both ways, and if someone crossed a line, whether it was a teacher, a friend, or anyone else, I had a right to let them know. Standing up for myself didn't mean being rude or disrespectful, it just meant being honest. It meant speaking up when something hurt, instead of keeping it inside until I exploded. The outburst in class wasn't my proudest moment. In fact, there were still days when I'd cringe a little thinking about it. But I'd learned that even though I'd made a mistake, it wasn't unforgivable. I was allowed to make mistakes, to feel things deeply, to learn as I went along. And as long as I took those lessons to heart, as long as I grew from them, that was what really mattered. Looking back, I think that moment changed something in me. I felt more sure of myself, more confident that I could handle difficult situations, even when they made me uncomfortable. I started to notice other places in my life where I'd been holding back, not wanting to ruffle any feathers or cause conflict. And slowly, I began setting boundaries in those areas too, being clearer about what was okay and what wasn't. Speaking up sooner instead of waiting until I was at a breaking point. I'm not perfect, and I know there'll be other times when I mess up, when I don't handle things the way I want to. But now I know that setting boundaries is something I can practice, that I can keep learning to do it with respect and honesty, without letting my anger take over. It's a balancing act, one I'm still figuring out, but I feel stronger now, like I found a new side of myself that I didn't know existed. At the end of the day, I'm grateful for that experience. As hard as it was, it taught me that my voice matters, that I have a right to feel safe and respected, and that I don't have to let anyone, even someone in authority, cross lines that make me uncomfortable. And maybe that's the most valuable thing I'll take with me, far beyond this class or this school. I'm moving forward with a little more self-respect, a little more courage, and a commitment to honoring my own boundaries. And for now, that's enough.
AITA for refusing to let my ex-wife take our daughter on a lavish vacation because I think it's unfair to our son. If you'd told me a few years ago that I'd be here, on the edge of a custody fight over a trip to Paris, I'd have laughed it off. But now, sitting in the middle of it, I'm not sure what to think. It all feels tangled up in emotions that have been brewing for years, ones I thought I'd buried after the divorce. So here's where it all started. My ex-wife and I split up 2 years ago. We tried to keep things as amicable as possible, mostly for the kids. We have two, a 12-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. The kids were young enough to not fully understand the split, but they were old enough to feel the effects. I don't think either of us realized how much the divorce would shape them, in different ways, as they adjusted to 2 households, 2 routines, and 2 very different parents. Since the split, I've been the steady parent, the one who handles the day-to-day routines, school pickups, homework, dentist appointments, you name it. I don't mind it. Honestly, it gives me a sense of structure, and I feel like it keeps the kids grounded. My ex-wife, on the other hand, has leaned into the role of the fun parent. You know, the one with the exciting weekend plans and surprise outings, the one who's always bringing something extra to the table. And now that she's engaged to a guy who's, well, wealthy, her version of fun has gone from spontaneous camping trips to things like surprise vacations. I guess it shouldn't be surprising. When we were married, I'd always been the one focused on budgeting and planning, and she was more carefree, often dreaming up the next adventure or last-minute trip idea. And I'm not saying I didn't appreciate that side of her, I did. In my own way. But after we divorced, I saw how much our different approaches affected the kids. My son, especially, started leaning on me for stability, looking to me as the consistent figure in his life. My daughter, on the other hand, idolized her mom's spontaneity, her way of making every outing feel like a big deal. I try to keep things fair between the kids, creating a sense of balance in my home. I'm not taking them on lavish trips, but I'm there for the little things, day in and day out. I like to think that's something they can count on. But now, with my ex ramping up the experiences, it feels like I'm in a strange place, caught between wanting to protect the kids from feeling less than, and knowing that I can't compete with that level of luxury. And that's where this whole issue with Paris came into play. My ex recently announced, out of nowhere, that she's planning to take our daughter on a special trip to Paris. Just the 2 of them. She called it a bonding experience, said it was something she'd always dreamed of doing, especially since our daughter loves art. But it was only for her and our daughter, and not my son. I'll never forget the look on my daughter's face when she told me about Paris. She was so excited, practically bouncing as she described the Eiffel Tower, the museums, all the things she'd read about and seen in pictures. And I get it. Paris is a dream for her. She loves art, is obsessed with anything that looks even remotely like a famous painting or sculpture. And here was her mom giving her this incredible opportunity. But then I looked over at my son. He was quiet, and I could see his face drop. The way he immediately pulled back into himself. Almost like he was bracing for disappointment. He asked, "Why can't I go too?" And my ex's answer, "Well, it just didn't sit right with me." She brushed it off with something vague. Like, "Oh, this is just a special trip for me and your sister." She promised to take him somewhere, someday. But I could already see how hurt he was. How he didn't believe her. My son has been through so much over the past couple of years. He was always a sensitive kid. And the divorce hit him harder than it did our daughter. I think he's been feeling a bit lost. Like he's not sure where he fits. And as much as I try to give him stability, I can't protect him from everything. This Paris trip, this big, glamorous outing without him, it felt like the last straw for him. He was heartbroken, but trying to hide it, shrugging like it didn't matter. Though I knew better, the more I thought about it, the more I could see how this trip could drive a wedge between him and his sister. Maybe even between him and his mom. My ex doesn't seem to get how much her actions affect him. And I could already see resentment brewing. To him, it probably looked like his mom was picking favorites, choosing our daughter to lavish attention on while he got left behind. I understand the appeal of bonding experiences, I really do. But why couldn't it be a family thing? Why not take both of them or find a way to make sure our son feels included? The last thing he needs is another reminder that his life is split in two or that his family dynamic is different from his friends. And as a dad, it's my job to make sure both kids feel equally valued, that they know they're loved. I felt like if I didn't step in now, I'd be failing him, allowing him to feel less than. So there I was, torn between understanding my ex's excitement for the trip and feeling this strong urge to protect my son from the hurt it was causing. I could feel my frustration building, knowing I had to say something, to make it clear that this wasn't fair. But I also knew that trying to have a calm conversation with her about it was going to be anything but easy. When I finally called my ex to talk about the Paris trip, I was already bracing myself. Conversations like these don't go well with us. We've had plenty of arguments since the divorce, and they rarely end with both of us feeling understood. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady and calm, focusing on how to get her to understand my perspective. I started off gently, telling her I understood why she wanted to take our daughter on this trip. That I saw the appeal of giving her this special experience. But, I added carefully, I think our son is really struggling with this. He doesn't understand why he's not invited. It's hard on him, and I don't want him to feel left out. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost feel her bristling before she even spoke. She sighed, almost dismissively, and replied, "This isn't about leaving him out. This is just something special for me and our daughter. She loves art, and this is a way for us to bond over that. It's nothing against him." I tried to stay calm, even though her answer felt like a brush off. I get that, but he doesn't see it that way. All he sees is that his sister is getting something amazing, and he's not part of it. He's already feeling a bit left out lately. Couldn't you plan something that includes him? Or maybe take both of them together? I think that would mean a lot to him. She cut me off, her voice sharper now, clearly annoyed. Listen, not everything has to be about fairness. She deserves to have something for herself, and he can have his turn later. I can't just cancel a trip because he's feeling left out. That's not realistic. I felt my frustration rising, and I could hear the edge slipping into my voice. But he's not just feeling left out, he's hurting. And this is just going to make it worse. You know how sensitive he is. This isn't some trivial thing. This trip could really impact how he sees his place in the family. Especially since you've been doing all these big things with the kids. She scoffed, and I could practically see her rolling her eyes through the phone. You think I don't care about him? He's my son too, and I know him just as well as you do. I'm going to take him somewhere. Just not now. And maybe this whole thing wouldn't be such an issue if you weren't so focused on making everything equal. That last part hit a nerve. I could feel my patience slipping. It's not about making everything equal, it's about making sure he doesn't feel like he's less important. That's not some petty concern. I'm trying to protect him from feeling like he's being overlooked. He's already dealing with enough after the divorce. She went quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe she'd finally heard me. But then she spoke, and her tone was colder. Defensive. This isn't about him, is it? You're just upset because I'm with someone who can give the kids things you can't. You're using him as an excuse to keep us from moving forward. You don't get to control what I do just because you can't do the same things. That stung. Deep down, I knew it wasn't about the money, at least. Not the way she made it sound. Sure, I couldn't afford a trip to Paris. I couldn't give them these over-the-top experiences like she could with her fiancé. But that wasn't the point. This was about fairness, about making sure both of our kids felt valued. Her comment made me feel small, like I was some jealous, bitter ex trying to sabotage her happiness. But that wasn't it. I was just trying to keep the family dynamic stable, to make sure our son didn't feel pushed aside. At that moment, I felt like I was hitting a wall. She wasn't going to see things my way. She'd made up her mind, and there was no convincing her otherwise. I could feel the anger building in my chest, but I tried to stay level. If you go through with this, and he's hurt by it, I'm not just going to sit back and watch. I might have to look at this from a legal perspective. I want what's best for both kids. Silence. I could feel her shock through the phone. Her disbelief that I'd even mentioned custody. But I meant it. I was willing to fight if it meant keeping my son from feeling neglected. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, her tone icy and clipped. Do what you have to do. But don't think for a second that this is about the kids. This is about you not wanting them to have anything you can't give them. You're punishing me, not protecting them. With that, she hung up, leaving me sitting there, staring at my phone, wondering if I'd gone too far. The threat of legal action was drastic, and a part of me regretted it instantly. But another part of me felt justified, determined to stand up for my son, even if it meant burning a few bridges along the way. After that call, I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, feeling a mixture of anger, regret, and a sinking sense of inevitability. I'd really gone there. I'd threatened custody. I knew it was a drastic step, but after seeing how she brushed off my son's feelings, how she dismissed my concerns like they were nothing, I couldn't think of any other way to make her understand. She'd always been the spontaneous one, the fun parent who wasn't bogged down by the same concerns I had. But this time, her fun was hurting our son, and I couldn't just let it slide. A part of me felt guilty. I'd always thought of custody as a last resort, a nuclear option that you only consider when everything else has failed. And here I was, using it as a threat. I could hear her voice in my head, calling me controlling, accusing me of trying to hold her back just because I couldn't give the kids the same experiences. Maybe there was a grain of truth to it. I didn't have the means to take them to Paris or buy them extravagant gifts. But this wasn't about jealousy. It was about keeping things fair. About making sure our son didn't feel like he was somehow less important just because he wasn't part of her new, bonding, plans. I tried to think of it from her perspective. Maybe she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, that this trip was a way to reconnect with our daughter. But even if that was true, she wasn't seeing the whole picture. She wasn't seeing how this was affecting our son, how his face fell every time he heard about her plans, how he tried to pretend like he didn't care, even though I could see it was eating him up inside. And I knew he was too young to fully understand it. He couldn't see the big picture. All he knew was that his mom was choosing his sister for something special. And he was left waiting for a someday that might never come. I spent the next few days stewing over it, going back and forth in my mind. One moment, I'd feel completely justified. This was about protecting my son, making sure he felt valued and loved, making sure he didn't grow up feeling like he was second best. The next moment, I'd be filled with doubt, wondering if I'd overstepped, if I was letting my frustration with my ex turn into something bigger than it needed to be. Was I really ready to go down the path of a custody battle just to prove a point? In the end, I decided to hold firm. I wasn't doing this to be vindictive or controlling. I was doing it because I believed it was right for both kids. If she couldn't see how her actions were affecting our son, then maybe a wake-up call was necessary. And if that meant a custody battle, then so be it. I had to do what I thought was best, even if it meant standing alone in it. The kids still didn't know about any of this. They were blissfully unaware of the tension simmering between their mom and me. I'd kept it from them because I didn't want them to feel the weight of it. But I was on edge every time they brought up the trip. Every time my daughter talked excitedly about Paris or my son went quiet. Trying to hide his disappointment, I kept wondering if I was making the right call, if this would just deepen the divide in our family or if it would, in some way, bring us closer to a fairer arrangement. The threat of custody hung heavy between us, unspoken but powerful, and though a part of me still felt conflicted, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't sit back and watch my son be left behind. Even if it meant pushing things further than I'd ever imagined. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and self-doubt. I thought standing my ground would feel empowering, like I'd finally done something to protect my son. But instead, I found myself second-guessing every decision, replaying every word I'd said to my ex, wondering if I just made things worse. My family noticed I was distracted, and eventually, my sister pulled me aside to ask what was going on. She's always been the person I turn to when I need a reality check. Someone who understands how to see both sides of things. I told her everything, about the Paris trip, about how hurt my son was, about my ex brushing it off, and finally, about the threat of filing for full custody. I expected her to back me up, to tell me I'd done the right thing. But her reaction wasn't what I'd anticipated. "Are you sure you're doing this for him?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. "I know you care about him, but threatening custody, isn't that a little extreme?" Her words hit me like a splash of cold water. I tried explaining that it wasn't just about Paris or jealousy over the money. That it was about fairness, about making sure both kids felt valued. But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of her skepticism. She reminded me that divorce was hard enough on kids without parents using them to settle their own grudges. I wanted to be mad, to tell her she didn't understand, that this wasn't about my pride, but the doubt was already there, and her words just amplified it. Had I let my frustration with my ex-wife cloud my judgment? Was I actually punishing her for her lifestyle, her new fiancé, the things she could give the kids that I couldn't? I didn't want to believe that was true, but I could feel the guilt creeping in, making me question if my motives were as pure as I thought. I talked to a few other close friends, hoping they'd tell me I was right to stand firm. They mostly echoed what my sister had said, though they were more supportive. I get it, one friend said, but maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe you don't have to go full custody battle just to get her to see your side. Another friend pointed out that dragging things into court might make it worse for the kids, turning what should be a happy memory into a constant reminder of conflict between their parents. Each conversation left me feeling more conflicted. I started to wonder if there was any way to make her see reason without escalating things. After all, I hadn't wanted this to turn into a war. I just wanted her to understand that what she was doing was hurting our son. But now it felt like I was caught in a trap of my own making, with no clear way out. Late one night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying all the arguments I'd had with my ex since the divorce. All the ways we'd clashed over the kids. I realized that, somewhere along the way, I'd started seeing her as an opponent, not a partner in parenting. And while I still believed that my son's feelings were valid, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd let my own resentment color the way I'd handled things. But every time I thought about backing down, I remembered the look on my son's face when he found out he wasn't going to Paris. That feeling of heartbreak, of being sidelined, was something I couldn't ignore. I wasn't willing to just sit by and watch him get hurt again, even if it meant taking a harder path to make sure he felt loved and valued. And yet, I knew that if I pushed this too far, it could end up hurting him just as much, if not more. So there I was, caught between guilt and justification, between the need to protect my son and the fear that I was letting my own insecurities get in the way. It felt like no matter what I chose, someone would end up hurt. And maybe, just maybe, that someone would be me. As the days stretched on, I felt this constant pull to reevaluate my decision. Every time I thought about filing for full custody, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, heavier with each passing day. I couldn't deny that my reaction to the Paris trip was complicated by feelings I hadn't fully addressed, resentment toward my ex-wife, frustration over her new lifestyle, and a nagging worry that I'd always be the less exciting parent. But I also couldn't ignore my son's hurt. I'd been the one wiping away his tears after the divorce, reassuring him that he mattered, that he was loved. So, the thought of him feeling left out, feeling less important, it broke me. I knew I needed to get clear on what I was really fighting for here. Was this about one trip, one moment where our daughter got something special? Or was it about a pattern, about making sure that both kids felt equally valued, that they knew they could rely on both parents? So, I did what I always do when I need to think things through. I went for a drive. The car was quiet, and with every mile I drove, my thoughts began to settle. I realized that the root of this whole issue was my own need for balance and fairness. My ex-wife and I had never been good at finding common ground. And this Paris trip felt like a symbol of everything we'd struggled with since the divorce. She was living a new life, making new plans, and I was here, doing the day-to-day work of parenting. But I wasn't going to let that difference make me forget what mattered most, that both kids felt equally loved, regardless of their parents' differences. Thinking about it this way, I realized that I might have taken things too far with the custody threat. I wasn't even sure I wanted full custody. I just wanted her to see how important it was for us to be on the same page when it came to the kids. Threatening custody had been my way of getting her attention, but maybe it had also pushed her further away, made her feel defensive rather than understanding. I couldn't keep making this about power or control, about winning or losing. I needed to make it about the kids. Plain and simple. I knew I couldn't control how my ex-wife chose to parent or how she handled her relationships with each child. But I could control how I responded to my own children's needs. I could be the one they came to when they felt hurt. The one who made sure they felt seen and valued. And maybe, instead of fighting against her, I could find a way to work with her, to get her to see that this was about making sure our son didn't feel left out, didn't feel like he was second best. When I got home, I sat down and made a plan. I'd have one more conversation with my ex-wife. But this time, I'd try to put my pride aside, to speak honestly without letting my emotions take control. I'd tell her that I understood her desire to bond with our daughter, that I appreciated her making an effort to connect. But I'd also explain, calmly, that our son's feelings were real, that he needed to feel equally valued, and that I'd like us to work together to make sure he didn't feel left out of her plans. In the end, I knew I couldn't force her to agree with me. I couldn't control her choices or make her see things exactly as I did. But I could choose to keep my focus on what truly mattered, the well-being of both our kids. And if that meant finding a way to compromise, to let go of my need for control, then so be it, because at the end of the day, this wasn't about me or her, it was about them. And I'd do whatever it took to make sure they knew that they were both loved and valued. No matter what, when I finally called my ex-wife again, I was prepared for the tension, for the chance that this conversation would end like the last one. But I went into it differently this time, without the edge of anger or the need to win. I just wanted her to see things from my perspective, to understand that this was about making sure both kids felt equally loved. I started by telling her that I understood why she wanted to take our daughter to Paris. I get it, I said, doing my best to keep my tone even. It's a chance for you two to connect over something she loves. And I know you're doing it for the right reasons. She didn't say anything at first, but I could feel a change in her tone when she finally responded. It was softer, less defensive. "I'm glad you understand that. I just want to make memories with her. Something she'll remember." I took a deep breath, relieved we were actually talking rather than fighting. "I know, and I appreciate that, but I also see how hurt our son is by this. He doesn't understand why he's not part of it. To him, it feels like he's being left out, like he's somehow less important. I just don't want him to feel that way, especially not now, after everything they've been through with the divorce." There was a pause, and I braced myself for another defensive response. But instead, she sighed, almost as if she was letting go of something too. "You're right," she said quietly. "I didn't think about how he'd see it. I thought he'd understand that this was just something special for her. But maybe I should have been more sensitive." Hearing her say that felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. We weren't totally aligned, but at least she understood where I was coming from. We started talking through options, trying to figure out a way to make sure both kids felt valued. She suggested that when they got back, she could plan a separate trip with our son, something that played to his interests. Maybe it wouldn't be Paris, but it could still be something meaningful, something that showed him he was just as important to her. I could see this solution wasn't perfect, but it felt like progress. We discussed other ways to make sure both kids felt included, smaller things, too, like involving him in the planning for his own trip or spending special time with him before they left. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same side, trying to find a balance that worked for everyone. As we wrapped up the call, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't expected. I knew this wasn't a perfect solution, but I realized that compromise was part of co-parenting, especially after divorce. Maybe I wouldn't always agree with her decisions, and maybe she wouldn't always understand mine. But as long as we kept the kids at the center of it all, as long as we made sure they felt loved and valued, then we were doing something right. In the days that followed, I felt a shift in my own perspective. I'd been so focused on making sure everything was fair that I'd forgotten the nuances. The fact that parenting wasn't about making everything equal but about responding to each child's needs. I didn't have to compete with her wealth or her ability to give the kids extravagant experiences. I just had to be there for them, to show them that love isn't measured by trips or gifts, but by consistency, by being present, by caring about their feelings. As the trip approached, I made sure to spend extra time with my son, planning some small outings that he enjoyed and reassuring him that his mom would make time for him, too. I could see his spirits lifting, even if it was gradual, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose in my role as his dad. Maybe I couldn't take him to Paris, but I could give him something just as valuable, my full attention, my understanding, my commitment to being there for him, no matter what. Looking back, I realized this whole experience had taught me more than I expected. I'd learned that standing up for my kids didn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it meant finding ways to understand the other side, to reach a compromise that prioritized their well-being. And I'd learned that being a parent was less about the grand gestures and more about the quiet, steady presence that lets them know they're loved, day in and day out. As I watched my daughter excitedly prepare for her trip and saw my son's face light up as we planned our own smaller outings, I knew we'd found a way forward. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in the end, that's all that mattered. I was doing my best for my kids, loving them in the ways I could, and I realized that was enough.